Before we understand or look at action potential generation or generation of nerve impulse, remember the word polarity. Polarity is a polarized environment, opposite charges. So when a cell is polarized, the inside of the cell is more negative and the outside of the cell is more positive. So this happens during the resting stage. So when the cell is at rest, it has a resting membrane potential. And this resting membrane potential is different for every cell. For muscle cells, it's about 90 to 95 millivolt, but in case of nerve cells, the resting membrane potential is minus 70 millivolt. So this is the charge inside of the cell at rest. So because it's charged, the cell is called polarized during the resting stage. When a stimulus occurs, a stimulus can be a change in temperature, you being punched in the face, or you wanting to run, or a muscle being stimulated, right? All of these are stimulus. Stimulus is an external signal or an external change that causes an action potential and a nerve impulse, right? So when a stimulus occurs, when a stimulus occurs, it causes the cell to depolarize. So if polarity or polarization means a cell being charged, depolarization occurs when the inside of the cell becomes more positive, meaning due to the diffusion of ions, the charge on a cell, on the inside of the cell, starts to move towards a more positive voltage, right? So it's gradually moves to zero. From zero, if the ions continue to diffuse, it can move towards, say, plus 30 millivolt. Right? So this is called depolarization. During depolarization, a whole bunch of sodium channels open up and potassium channels open up. This causes a disturbance in the electrical charge inside of the cell. And at this point, the neuron is active. So when the cell is depolarized, the neuron is active. The sodium channels open up and allow a lot more sodium ions to diffuse into the cell really, really quickly, right? So this causes the negativity of the cell to move towards a positive charge. Now, another term you need to remember is repolarization. Repolarization. Repolarization is the term used for normalizing the cell. For a cell at a resting stage, the normal condition is a negative 70 millivolt charge because the inside is a lot more negative than the outside, right? So during repolarization, a lot of potassium gates open up and a lot of potassium ions diffuse out of the cell. So potassium ions leave cell to make the inside of the cell more negative to restore polarity. Okay, so remember the terms polarizations rather than polarity. You can remember the word polarized, correct. So the action potential or nerve impulse both mean the same thing. It causes movements of ions across the cell membrane, like when you throw a stone in a pond, it causes ripples. right? So that's what action potential does. When the dendrites receive a stimulus from somewhere else, right? The stimulus can be a temperature, change in pH, it can be pressure, anything, or a signal to allow the muscle to contract. So anything can be a stimulus. A stimulus is an external change in the environment or a signal. So um, generally, the ion channels in the cell membrane are closed, right? And we are going to focus on the sodium and potassium channels in the nerve. And the charge on the inside of the cell is more negative on the outside, if you looked at that, correct? So, and this is called resting membrane potential. Well, I need the pen. The resting membrane potential of the neuron, RMP. I want to write it in black. The resting membrane potential of a neuron is equal to negative 70 millivolt. So the first thing that happens is obviously we need a stimulus to cause disturbance in the charge. When the stimulus disturbs the charge inside the cell, it stimulates the first type of channels in the cell. And the first type of channels are called sodium, well, stimulus gated sodium channels. The stimulus gated sodium channels open up and hundreds of sodium ions enter into the cell. So let me label this. This becomes the internal intracellular fluid, and this area becomes the extracellular fluid. Okay, so that's the first step. And let's see, the resting membrane potential begins at minus 70 millivolt. So let's draw a graph along with it. When sodium ions rush into the cell, the cell moves from negative 70 towards a more positive charge, right? So when the charge of the cell reaches a threshold of about negative 55 millivolt, so that's the threshold, this kicks open more sodium channels in the cell, and these channels will now be called voltage. So the second, voltage gated sodium channels. So when the threshold reaches negative 55, the voltage gated sodium channels open up in hundreds more sodium ions, hundreds and thousands of sodium ions rushes into the cell. So now you have a lot of positive charges inside the cell. So the cell ends up becoming more positive as the sodium ion rushes in, and you can see this graph shoots up to a positive charge. Okay, so this happens to the cell, reaches about plus 30 or plus 40 millivolt, and this shift in the charge of the cell from negative 70 to positive 30 is called, well, depolarization. Depolarization. So at this point right over here, the sodium channel shut close after, they remain open for a few extra seconds, and as they all shut close, the impulse passes negative 30 millivolt, and this causes the next type of channel to open up, and these channels are called voltage. Well, let me just write it over here. These channels are called voltage gated potassium channels. Then the voltage gated potassium channels open up. Well, if you remember what we talked about previously, potassium channels tries to rush out of the cell, a lot of potassium ions move out of the cell to try to regain the negative charge of the cell. So the job of potassium channels is to try to repolarize the cell. So obviously you guessed it, what happens next is the cell begins to get repolarized. So the voltage begins to fall. As the voltage begins to fall, this is called repolarization. Now this depolarization and repolarization of the cell is called an action potential or a nerve impulse. Now, some potassium channels remain open a little too long, which causes the membrane potential to fall below the normal -70. So the cell becomes too polarized there for a fraction of a second, and this is called hyperpolarization. Hyperpolarization. Now, this hyperpolarization stage is really short-lived, and the potassium channels begin to shut close when the cell becomes hyperpolarized. So potassium channels shut close, Capel's channels close. Okay, and um, well, at this stage, the neuron cannot generate a new electrical impulse. So this stage wherein the potassium channels shut close and the next channels open up. So these next channels are the sodium potassium pump. So the fourth channel that opens up is the sodium potassium pump. Okay, so this stage wherein the cell gets hyperpolarized and cannot generate a new impulse is known as the refractory period. Okay, it's called the refractory period. Now this period is really short-lived, and during this period the sodium potassium pumps continue to work. And what do the sodium potassium pumps do? The sodium potassium pumps pump sodium and potassium. Obviously this is an active transport process. For every 3 sodium ions pumped out, the pump takes in 2 potassium ions, right? So the job of the sodium potassium pump is to restore the resting membrane potential back to -70. Now obviously this doesn't stop here, as the nerve impulse is generated. Now you see the nerve impulse being transferred from this region. Well, obviously it starts from the dendrite, it goes down the cell body, along the nodes of Ranvier. Saltatory conduction occurs and the nerve impulse transmission is transferred across the axon. Finally, the nerve impulse or the action potential arrives at the axon terminal. Now, do you remember what you studied in muscle physiology? What's going on at the axon terminal? It needs to transfer these electrical signal to the postsynaptic cell, right? In case of muscle physiology, the postsynaptic cell is the muscle, right? And the chemicals that transfer these electrical signals from the presynaptic cell, which is a neuron, to the postsynaptic cell is called a neurotransmitter. So when the action potential arrives at the axon terminal, they kick open the calcium channels, if you remember. Why are calcium channels important? Calcium channels allow inlet of calcium into the axon terminal. So calcium ions rush in. These calcium ions are important for release of neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft, right? And this is where the action potential comes in, right? So this is just a gist of what's happening at the axon terminal and along the axon. And keep in mind, so this whole process of depolarization and repolarization of the cell is called an action potential. An action potential is nothing but a fancy name for nerve impulse. And now we have generated an action potential or a nerve impulse.